In the Virginia of 1856, a woman's worth was measured in the grace of her dance and the strength of her stride. But for Elellanena Whitmore, the world ended at the age of 8. A snapped spine, a broken thing in a society that only valued the pristine. They called her damaged goods. 12 men, 12 cold, calculating suitors, looked at the 5,000 acres of the Whitmore estate, and then at her useless legs, and they walked away. But her father, the colonel, was a man driven by a desperate dark pragmatism. He knew that when he died, the law would strip her of everything. So, he made a choice that would send a shiver through the Piedmont. He didn't look to the planter class for her protector. He looked to the forge. He looked to a man the world called the Brute, a 7-foot-tall blacksmith named Josiah, bound in chains but possessing a soul that Virginia wasn't ready to understand. This isn't just a story of a forced union. It is a haunting tale of two outcasts, one discarded by her blood, the other owned by the law, who found a terrifying, beautiful strength in each other, while a dying world watched in horror. The Piedmont air carried the scent of curing tobacco and ancient, rot-tinged tradition, a landscape where a woman's value was weighed like a harvest. For Elellanena Whitmore, the golden light of the Virginia sun served only to illuminate the prison of her own skin. Since the age of 8, when a splintering log had silenced the music of her spine, she had been a ghost haunting the corridors of her father's 5,000-acre empire. While other girls practiced the art of the curtsy and the flirtatious tilt of a lace fan, she mastered the silent rotation of mahogany wheels. Her existence was a paradox of extreme luxury and absolute isolation, a life lived behind the glass of high windows. To the planter class, she was no longer a person, she was a cautionary tale of fragility. 12 times the heavy oak doors of Whitmore Estate opened to receive suitors, and 12 times those doors slammed shut on her future. These men did not come seeking a soul or a partner. They came to inspect an asset, only to recoil at the sight of her chair. They looked at her useless legs with a mixture of pity and revulsion, as if her disability were a contagious stain on their lineage. Each rejection was a calculated blow, delivered with the polite cruelty of the Southern aristocracy that prized physical perfection above all. One by one, the names of Virginia's elite crossed her father's list, and one by one, they were scratched out in bitter ink. She watched from the shadows as her worth plummeted, becoming a burden that no amount of dowry could offset. The whispers began in the parlors of Charlottesville, spreading like a slow, moving fever through the tobacco fields and into the ballrooms. It was not enough that she could not walk. The town gossip stripped her of her womanhood entirely with the venomous rumor of infertility. Doctors who had never touched her pulse speculated that her broken back had withered her womb, branding her damaged goods in a society built on the necessity of heirs. To these men, a wife who could not stand at the head of a table or bear children without complication was a structural defect. She became the crippled Whitmore girl, a title that echoed through the hills until it felt more like a sentence than a name. Her education and her sharp, philosophical mind were viewed as useless ornaments on a shattered vessel. Colonel Whitmore watched his daughter's spirit retreat into the dusty corners of his library, his own guilt manifesting as a suffocating, distant affection. He had indulged the child who wanted to ride the spirited horse, and now he was the architect of her loneliness in a world that forbade her independence. The law was a tightening noose. As an unmarried woman with a physical infirmity, Elellanena was a legal ghost with no right to the land she loved. Upon the colonel's death, the sprawling estate and its 200 souls would pass to a distant, disinterested cousin, leaving her at the mercy of cold charity. The terror of her becoming a ward in some sunless boarding house gnawed at her father's pride until his desperation curdled into a dark, radical resolve. He saw his daughter's humanity being erased by her own peers, and it drove him toward a choice. By the winter of 1855, the atmosphere at the estate had turned cold and claustrophobic, thick with the silence of a house waiting for a funeral. Elellanena lived in a state of suspended animation, her Greek and Latin texts the only voices that did not speak to her with condescension. She was a queen of a hollow kingdom, surrounded by imported crystal and French silk, yet she possessed less agency than the soil beneath her wheels. The final rejection from a portly, drunken widower had been the tipping point, proving that even the bottom of the social barrel felt superior to her. She was 22 years old, trapped in a body the world called a ruin, and living in a house that felt like a tomb. Little did she know that the man intended to save her was currently hammering iron in the dark heat of the forge. The colonel paced the confines of his study, the amber liquid in his glass catching the dying light of a Virginia sunset. He was a man of cold logic, a soldier who understood that a flank once turned was a battle lost. His daughter's future was a fortress under siege, and every legal avenue for her protection had been systematically leveled by the cruelty of the era. In the eyes of the Commonwealth, Elellanena was a non-entity, a creature whose physical fragility rendered her legally incompetent to hold the reins of her own inheritance. The 5,000 acres of prime tobacco land were not a sanctuary for her, but a prize waiting to be snatched by the next male in the lineage. He knew that the moment his heart ceased to beat, his daughter's life of refinement would dissolve into the bitter ashes of dependency. The law of 1856 was a heartless machine, designed to move property from man to man while bypassing the hands of women entirely. Virginia's statutes were clear: without a husband to act as her legal proxy, Elellanena would be cast out by the probate courts upon the colonel's passing. He could envision his cousin Robert, a man with a ledger for a heart, selling the mahogany furniture and the French chandeliers before the funeral flowers had even wilted. Robert would see the girl in the wheelchair not as a cousin to be cherished, but as a liability to be tucked away in some cheap, damp room. The thought of his daughter, educated in the classics and refined in spirit, begging for a pittance from a man who despised her existence, drove the colonel to a state of quiet, focused madness. It was this desperation that birthed a plan so radical it bordered on the heretical within the rigid confines of Southern society. If the white men of the planter class were too blind to see her value, then the colonel would look outside the boundaries of proper civilization for a protector. He needed a man who was physically formidable enough to act as her legs, but legally bound to her so he could never walk away. His gaze shifted from the polished floors of the manor house toward the rising smoke of the blacksmith's forge at the edge of the property. There sat the solution, a man who was already treated as property by the law, yet possessed the strength of 10 common suitors. By tying his daughter's fate to an enslaved man, the colonel was preparing to burn the social contract to save her. He summoned his lawyers and his overseers, testing the legal boundaries of a union that society would never recognize as a marriage, but the law could recognize as an assignment of duty. He wasn't looking for a romantic match. He was looking for a sentinel, a human shield to stand between his daughter and a world that wanted to discard her. The logic was as brutal as it was brilliant. A man who owned nothing would have everything to gain by protecting the woman who treated him with dignity. Josiah, the man they called the Brute, was the only soul on the estate with the physical power to carry her through the literal and metaphorical storms to come. The Colonel knew the neighbors would scream of scandal, but he had long since stopped listening to the whispers of a world that had already sentenced his child to a life of misery. The decision was finalized over a map of the estate, a document that detailed every fence line and tobacco barn the Colonel intended to preserve for his kin. He realized that by giving his daughter to Josiah, he was creating a bubble of protection that no Virginia court could easily pierce. It was a transaction of souls, a white woman who was a prisoner of her body, and a black man who was a prisoner of the law, forged into a single unit of survival. He felt the weight of history pressing against the walls of his study, knowing that this choice would either be her salvation or their mutual destruction. With a steady hand, he signed the papers that would set this unprecedented social experiment into motion. The master was about to make a slave the guardian of his most precious treasure, and the foundations of Whitmore Estate would never be the same. The morning sun filtered through the heavy velvet drapes of the parlor, casting long, nervous shadows across the polished floorboards where Elellanena waited. She sat positioned by the window, her hands gripping the mahogany armrests of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles turned a ghostly white. The house was silent, yet the air felt thick with a mounting pressure, as if the very walls were holding their breath in anticipation. Then came the sound, a heavy, rhythmic thudding that seemed to vibrate through the floor and settle deep within her chest. It was the approach of a giant, a sequence of footsteps so deliberate and powerful they signaled the arrival of something elemental. The door groaned on its hinges, and the sunlight was suddenly eclipsed by a figure that seemed to swallow the entire entryway. Josiah did not merely walk into the room. He loomed, his massive frame forced to duck beneath the ornate header of the doorframe. He stood 7 feet tall, a mountain of dark, weathered skin and corded muscle that looked as though it had been forged from the very iron he worked. His shoulders were so broad they seemed to bridge the gap between the world of the living and the world of myth, casting a shadow that reached Elellanenna's feet. He wore the rough, stained cotton of a laborer, the fabric straining against the impossible contours of his chest and arms. He kept his head bowed, a practiced gesture of servitude, yet his presence possessed a gravity that made the delicate French furniture look like fragile toys. The Brute had arrived, and the sheer physicality of him felt like a sudden, breathtaking storm in the quiet room. Elellanena felt a surge of primal fear as her eyes traveled from his scarred, soot-stained boots to the massive, club-like fingers clasped before him. This was the man her father intended to be her shadow, a creature who looked as though he could snap her spine a second time without even trying. She searched his face for the cruelty she had been told to expect from a man of his reputation, but found only a mask of wary, stoic endurance. Her father stood between them, a small man by comparison, his voice sounding thin and distant as he performed the hollow introductions. Josiah's eyes flicked upward for a fleeting second, a flash of deep, liquid brown meeting her gaze before retreating back to the floor. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the parlor. When the Colonel finally withdrew to his study, the atmosphere shifted from tense formality to an intimate, terrifying brand of isolation. Elellanena found her voice, though it felt brittle and foreign in her throat, asking the giant if he intended to sit. Josiah's gaze swept over the spindly embroidered chairs, and for the first time, a look of genuine hesitation crossed his weathered features. He spoke in a voice that was unexpectedly soft, a low rumble like distant thunder that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. He declined the chairs, fearing his 300-pound frame would reduce the wood to splinters, and opted instead for the edge of the heavy sofa. The furniture groaned under his weight, a physical manifestation of the impossible burden they were both being asked to carry together. As they sat in the heavy silence, Elellanena realized that the man before her was as much a prisoner of his own reputation as she was of her chair. She saw the scars on his hands, the burns from the forge, and the deep-seated sadness that lined the corners of his eyes, betraying a soul that did not match his monstrous exterior. He was a man defined by the fear of others, a titan forced into the posture of a dog, yet he moved with a careful, deliberate gentleness. The horror of the situation began to melt into a strange, shared recognition of their mutual status as outcasts in a world of small-minded men. She looked at the brute and saw not a threat, but a mirror reflecting her own discarded humanity back at her. In that moment, the parlor ceased to be a room of judgment and became a sanctuary where two broken legends began to speak. The tension in the parlor began to shift as Elellanena steered the conversation toward a territory few dared to let an enslaved man enter: the world of the mind. She asked the question that her father had whispered in secret, a query that carried the weight of a legal death sentence in the state of Virginia. Josiah's reaction was immediate and visceral, a flicker of genuine terror crossing his face before he realized that her eyes held no malice. He admitted, in a voice barely louder than a breath, that he had taught himself the forbidden art of reading in the dead of night. He had stolen moments with discarded newspapers and tattered pamphlets, piecing together the alphabet by the orange glow of the cooling forge. It was a confession of intellectual rebellion, a hidden fire that burned as fiercely as the coals he tended for the Whitmore estate. When the conversation turned to the works of Shakespeare, the giant seemed to physically transform, his bowed shoulders straightening with a new, quiet dignity. He spoke of the Tempest, and the way he analyzed the character of Caliban sent a jolt of recognition through Elellanenna's weary heart. To Josiah, Caliban was not a monster by nature, but a being made monstrous by the theft of his island and the chains of his master. He saw the island as a metaphor for a stolen life, a place where magic was used to subdue the spirit and words were used only to curse. His insights were not the rote recitations of a schoolboy, but the raw, lived wisdom of a man who understood the architecture of oppression. In the shadows of the parlor, the brute revealed himself to be a philosopher, his mind a vast, uncharted landscape of thought. Elellanena found herself leaning forward, her own education finally finding a vessel that did not look upon her with the condescending pity of the Richmond elite. They discussed the nuances of power and the fragility of the human condition, their voices weaving a tapestry of shared understanding that transcended race and status. She realized that while she had been trapped by the limits of her physical body, Josiah had been trapped by the limits of a society that refused to acknowledge his intellect. Their conversation became a sanctuary, a private rebellion against a world that demanded she be a helpless doll and he a mindless beast of burden. The books on her father's shelves, once symbols of her isolation, were suddenly transformed into keys that could unlock the heavy doors of their mutual imprisonment. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of her unmarriageability felt light, replaced by the electricity of a mind that matched her own. As the hours slipped away, the physical distance between the mahogany wheelchair and the edge of the sofa seemed to vanish, bridged by the shared language of the soul. Josiah's enormous, scarred hands gestured with surprising grace as he spoke of Prospero's staff and the inherent tragedy of a man who could command spirits, but not his own conscience. He saw the irony in a world that called him a savage while it practiced the most sophisticated forms of human cruelty daily. Elellanena watched the light play across his weathered features, noting the way his eyes sparked with a fierce, brilliant hunger for the knowledge that had been denied to him. He was no longer a blacksmith to her, nor a solution to a legal problem, but a companion in a war against a culture of ignorance. The intellectual intimacy they forged in those 2 hours was more profound than any courtship the 12 suitors could have ever offered. By the time the sun began to dip behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, the agreement between them was no longer a matter of her father's desperate command. It was a pact made in the spirit of Caliban and Miranda, a recognition that they were the only 2 truly free people on the 5,000-acre estate. Josiah's promise to protect her was no longer a duty assigned by a master, but a vow made to a peer who had finally looked past the iron and the scars. Elellanena felt a strange, terrifying hope take root in the ruins of her life, a sense that her father's radical plan might actually be a stroke of genius. They were 2 outcasts who had found a common tongue in the works of a long-dead poet, and in doing so, they had begun to rewrite the script of their lives. The parlor was no longer a room of judgment. It was the birthplace of a revolution that Virginia was not yet ready to see.